Hello, everyone. Today, I want to discuss the Kyle Rittenhouse case. More specifically, I want to discuss the Kenosha shootings, kind of like more broadly. I want to discuss the rioting leading up to the shootings. I want to talk about what Kenosha is. I want to move into some of the footage. I want to move into some of the specifics of the trial. But overwhelmingly, I want to discuss narratives, right? And I want to talk about why perhaps things happen in the way they do, whether it's the media or the sort of conservative machine that we have going on in that part of the media. How liberals tend to shape narratives, how conservatives tend to shape counter narratives, and what all this means and perhaps why they do it. Now, to give a little bit of background, I was actually not very interested in this case, right, as a legal case, because when this first happened, right, this was in August of 2020. Just like most people following this, I watched the video footage, and it was pretty obvious to me, even back then, that even if Rittenhouse did not have some sort of foolproof self defense claim, he probably had a very solid self defense claim based on the footage, based on my understanding of Wisconsin law. And it just didn't make sense for me to get like all emotionally involved in some kind of outcome, right? In the way that liberals, right, were very much not only emotionally involved, but they were just absolutely convinced that he was going to be convicted. I didn't think that was going to happen, from the beginning, right? The only thing that could have changed that outcome was if we had new evidence that was presented, right? If there was something else that the prosecution could bring in. And instead, we simply had a drip, drip, drip of evidence over the past year or so that didn't really seem like it was going to change much for anyone involved. That doesn't mean, however, that we can't discuss the case as it relates to, I think, far more interesting and consequential questions. And I think it's telling that both liberals and conservatives, as they shape their ideologies, as they shape their various narratives surrounding this, they really try to suppress questions that I think are very obvious to me. And the reason for that is they both have something to lose, right? They both have something that they need to defend. Either it's like some sort of like culture war reputation, or perhaps they're waging another culture war battle. Perhaps they're trying to sort of defend their, activity or lack of activity in these various like places that constantly experience riots over the past few decades. But at any rate, my thesis for this video is as follows. I think that liberals were pretty awful at shaping the Kenosha narrative. This was true pretty much from the beginning, where it was kind of obvious that lots of people discussing the case didn't actually watch the footage. It became even more obvious when Rittenhouse was painted as some sort of like neo-Nazi, fascist, white supremacist, white nationalist, whatever. Because I mean, it's not very relevant to the case, right? It wouldn't really change the outcome based on the footage. And it also struck me as extraordinarily desperate, right? In the sense that liberals very much wanted a specific person to blame for this violence. And they wanted a specific person to blame because if you really think about it, the only reason why these riots can occur ever is because you have such terrible conditions. And I'm going to actually talk about Kenosha as a county, as a city, right? That's the other missing part of this, right? I'm sure the vast majority of people consuming media about this know nothing about Kenosha and absolutely have no idea why it would specifically be this kind of city that would be prone to rioting, that would be prone later to a militia forming, and that would be prone after the violence, after the militia forms. It would be prone to the violence that just kind of comes inevitably as a result of such things. And I do blame liberals very much for the conditions of Kenosha, right? It doesn't make sense to think otherwise, right? A lot of these states, like the sort of, the blue wall states, right? They've been under Democratic control for a while. That started to splinter more recently with Trump. People started sort of exiting the Democratic Party after Obama failed to deliver on certain promises. So it makes total sense to me that liberals, in surveying someone to blame, they focus specifically on a guy or a kid, however you want to characterize him, or they specifically focus on one march, right? Or in one city or in one instance of violence, and they don't want to talk about the sort of macro issues involved. And conservatives, for their part, right, although they didn't sort of, they didn't have to do the kind of, legal trickery, right? You would see like tons of stuff going like from 2020 into 2021. Conservatives would just didn't have to make stuff up, right? They didn't really have to talk about anything other than the footage, right? That's not to say that in other situations they wouldn't make shit up. Of course they would, right? Very similar situations could occur with black people involved, shooting at white people, right? They would probably take a very different view of this, especially if the ideologies were sort of flipped. So they don't get a pass in general, right? And they only get a pass here by happenstance. They get a pass for cynical reasons, just like liberals are very cynical in how they approached all of this as well. And conservatives seem like they really have failed everyone involved, right? They definitely have failed Kenosha, right? Their ideas are not going to help Kenosha in any way. If you believe that riots are so terrible, it is in fact the biggest moral failing to not prevent them in the future. And the only way to not prevent them is to have some reason for people not to riot. You can't simply form militias. You can't simply depend on the police, right? Which is why the militia was formed, right? Police moves away from that. You need to basically eliminate all the reasons why people riot. So conservative ideas aren't going to help this. Conservatives also have not helped Kyle Rittenhouse. Rittenhouse himself talked about early on when he was involved in, just getting money for a legal defense, right? He kind of became this overnight celebrity. And tons of conservatives that kind of, jumped in this bandwagon, they really exploited him, right? They kept him in jail longer, right? Because they wanted to raise more money. This is obviously something not something that he wanted, not something that his family wanted. All sorts of really kind of like goofy doofuses got involved in the case, right? People like what is his name? Lynn Wood or Jeremy Wood or whatever his name is. Other people that basically like tried to like exploit his family after the fact, demanding money from them, so on and so forth, right? And Rittenhouse comes from like a very poor family. His mother, I believe, declared bankruptcy a few years ago. So they failed like in that way, right? Just kind of like the vultures just sort of started hovering over this kid from the very beginning. And they also just never really pushed back, right? In terms of their own values, right? Like, if you're going to become part of a militia, I think most conservatives don't like the idea of child soldiers. And to the extent that Kyle Rittenhouse was legally allowed to be a de facto child soldier under the sort of rubric of whatever like militias that he, temporarily linked up with, right? He went to defend this car dealership, right? And like nobody like bothered to ask like, oh, you look kind of young, or like, oh, like, do you go to college? Do you go to high school? Nobody asked for any kind of ID. You just have a 17-year-old kid that shows up as part of a militia, and he behaves in a way that is kind of different from a lot of other militia members, at least for the time being. Right, we're going to get into some of the more specifics later about all that. Right, I want to talk about the militia. Right, I feel like there's not been enough questioning of what exactly they were doing. What was their behavior? Did the crowd in general have some sort of self-defense claim against the militia itself? Right, this would really kind of change, some of the situation in terms of how it's being perceived. But conservatives, they sort of cheered this on. They turned Rittenhouse, who acted like a complete idiot into a hero, right? And he's clearly not a hero in any way. And by kind of like filling his head with all this garbage that, you're a hero for doing this, they really stunted his growth, right? I feel like, especially watching some of the interviews that he gave after, and some of his behavior right after the shooting, right? Going to these bars, hanging out with people that he shouldn't be really hanging out with. Granted, yes, he didn't know that those were Proud Boys at the bar and whatnot, but he did show up in a shirt that said "free as fuck," right? I think, given what transpired that night, if I were in his situation, even if I were to believe that I have a perfectly valid self-defense claim, at least two people, of the three that he shot, were sort of doing the right thing. Actually, as Ryan Balch of the militia that he linked up with, that's the argument that Ryan Balch makes. It's an interesting argument, especially coming from a person that seems to be pretty far on the right, at least in some ways. And conservatives, like, they don't, they don't really care about Rittenhouse, right? They say things like, well, if more people had guns, maybe this kind of thing wouldn't happen. When in fact, like, it's pretty obvious based on the video footage and nothing else. If everybody had guns, if all the protesters had guns, Rittenhouse would not be alive. So it makes me wonder. I mean, do you care about Kyle Rittenhouse's life, or are you just saying that, right? And there's this tweet from Benjamin Studebaker that's up on the screen right now. And Benjamin Studebaker, he's a kind of, I guess you could call him a Marxist kind of writer or commentator. Pretty young, still under 30. He, I believe, either has a PhD or is working on a PhD now. And he's a pretty good writer, right, on these topics. And I think this tweet that he sent out makes a lot of sense, right? And this kind of explains part of the reason, at least, why I wasn't so concerned with the trial up until the very end. And the tweet reads as follows: I have a hard time getting interested in media stories about trials, crimes, corruption. They heavily emphasize individual moral agents and discourage structural thinking. Meanwhile, in China, there's a fascinating institutional power struggle no one will tell me about. And I mean, this is true, right? My whole kind of, preface here is about this fact, right? We as liberals want to turn Rittenhouse into some sort of like fascist or Nazi or whatever, simply because, like, you want to find someone to blame, right? And specifically, the blame tends to be one of ideas, right? If only Rittenhouse had the right ideas in his head, this wouldn't have happened, right? If only rioters had the right ideas in their head, they wouldn't be rioters. And, this is just silly. That's not really how the world works. There is a structural cause for all this. The problem with talking about structural causes is they ensnare the very same people that you will go out and say, vote for him, vote for her. And they also ensnare you, right? And people don't want to feel culpable. They don't want to feel guilty, right? This is why Rittenhouse is an arch villain on the one hand, or a hero on the other hand, right? There's no room for middle ground here, right? And I believe that the obvious middle ground is, here's someone that acted completely irresponsibly, stupidly. If you had a different country with a different set of laws, I wouldn't be comfortable with, like, putting him away for life, right? He would probably have to pay some sort of penalties, right? Attenuated by the fact that he is a 17-year-old, right? Surrounded by adults that he was absolutely taking his cues from. That's the other crazy part that nobody wants to talk about. He was taking so many cues from a misbehaving militia. And by militia, I mean all the militias there. It wasn't just the Kenosha Guard. There were a bunch of different, kinds of militias there, different groups of people with different intentions, different techniques, different tactics. But as far as I know, they were all adults. He was the only one that wasn't an adult. And he behaved precisely and exactly according to the cues that he was given. This is to be expected. So let's get into some of the specifics, right, that I think are relevant, that haven't been talked about enough, especially by liberals, right? And the reason why I'm going to be especially hard on liberals here is They've spent decades, and especially the last 4 years, talking about being the adults in the room. They're the adults in the room. And guess what? If you in fact believe that you're the adult in the room, that means that you have a special set of responsibilities that others don't have. I don't really care about conservatives and I don't really care about Republicans because I have given up on them doing anything worthwhile a long time ago. Okay? But if you tell me that you are the responsible party and I see you behaving in an irresponsible fashion, I'm sorry, but you have now, right, greater culpability than conservatives do. Okay? Just like, if you ever have a job, right, and if you happen to be a good worker, you know how it works every single time. If you're a good worker, you're going to be doing the work of a lot of other people, and you could bitch about it, you could complain about it, you could say life's not fair, but that's kind of what you have to undertake if you wish to be in the position of feeling like a good worker, feeling proud of yourself, feeling good about doing the right thing. Same here. If you're a liberal and you want to feel proud about doing the right thing, doing good, so on and so forth, you're going to have to act like it, and you're going to have to take upon special responsibilities that, sorry, I will never ever give a conservative because I have given up on them. All right, so by way of background, I've actually done a couple of videos. I did a video on Glenn Loury and John McWhorter. They basically have a podcast, usually together, although the Glenn show features other guests as well. And I did a video criticizing their take on the George Floyd protests last year. I did something on the Ahmaud Arbery shooting last year. And basically the argument that I made there is some of the argument that I'm going to make here, which is riots occur for a very predictable set of reasons. In fact, I'm not sure if people even realize this, but the vast majority of racial riots, and definitely all the racial riots that I can think of in American history, they all begin with the same reason, right? They all begin with the same cause, meaning the proximal cause, right? There's these far deeper distal causes that, again, people never want to talk about, but the proximate cause is almost always some sort of case of police brutality, right? For a cop beating up a black guy, or sometimes a black woman or whatever, and this tends to cause riots, right? So I have a slide here. And there's a picture here of the Watts riots, right, in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles in the 1960s. There's also the Watts Tower, which I believe was done over maybe a couple of decades or so. I always found it kind of interesting that this is kind of like essentially like the mascot for Watts as a neighborhood, right? It's still, decades later, it's still impoverished. It's not mostly black anymore. It's primarily Hispanic now, but still going through the same issues. And this this weird thing that is like so, foreboding and forbidding, ugly to look at, in some ways, perhaps even just completely pointless. It's there, right? And it's supposed to represent this neighborhood, and I guess in some ways it does, being what it looks like. Anyway, the reason why I brought up the Watts riots is the Watts riots also began because of an instance of police brutality. At that point, it was the most kind of like damaging set of riots in American history, with the exception, of course, of like whatever occurred during the Civil War, whatever that occurred during the Revolutionary War, and there was an instance of police brutality, right? And black people got upset, they got fed up, and lots of rumors spread. Maybe not all the information was accurate, but the point is, it doesn't really matter, right? When you talk about like accuracy of information, I mean, the point is, like, you have a bunch of people that feel like they are in a ghetto, right? They're constantly being, if not beat up, then at least harassed by cops, right? Which things that don't ever make it into any kind of crime statistics, police brutality statistics, right? Everybody finds like the shooting of unarmed black men to be like so sexy and worth talk about, and obviously it is. But there's a lot of other stuff that ought to be discussed, right? That doesn't make it in, right? And police harassment is one of them, right? You can't measure police harassment other than anecdotal evidence that is just mostly ignored. But this is a poor community. There's tons of problems beyond police brutality. Police brutality is not even, the top 10 of the issues that you have to deal with as a black person growing up in these kinds of neighborhoods. So there's like 1,000 different reasons why a riot would occur. And the one reason that people tend to take seriously are reasons involving cops, because that is something that's sexy, right? That is something that people tend to care about. You could have a video footage that captures it. You could have photos. You could have witnesses, right? It's this sort of instantiation of everything that is miserable about living in a place like Watts, being brought out in like the most kind of violent way possible, right? So this is the thing that people look at. This is what they care about. And black men, again and again, they keep offering up their fucking mangled bodies, right, as they get beaten by batons, as they get shot at, as essentially, a sort of unwitting and, without any kind of consent, right? It's non-consensual. They're non-consensual sacrifices, at the altar of incremental progress, right, is always what it's called. It's what, Steven Pinker would talk about. So it's not surprising that every single instance, right, of racial rioting that we could point to begins with A, police brutality, and B, and this is the secondary part that's important, it has to be in neighborhoods that are prone to rioting, okay? I live, a couple miles away from a very rich black neighborhood. There could be 2 miles away of an instance of police brutality. There could be, a shooting of an unarmed black man. And there could be rioting in some of these neighborhoods that are further away from this rich black neighborhood. But the rioting is never going to enter a rich black neighborhood because they have no reason to riot, right? If you're educated, if you're upper class, you have other ways of either, expressing yourself. You have other ways of, sort of getting your voice heard. And because of that, you're not going to enter into some sort of mental zone where you're going to go out and like take advantage of like some situation, right? Because rioting is often, this is what it is, right? It starts as protesting. You have people that are sort of more criminal minded. They're going to steal stuff. And then you have people that, they just want to take shit because they don't have anything themselves, right? And you can't really blame them structurally. But if you're in a rich black neighborhood, it doesn't matter that, some black guy got shot 2 miles away, right? You don't need to take anything. There's nothing there that's forcing you to do that, right? And people don't really get that. And one thing that's interesting is, I watch, like I listen to like a bunch of like conservative and liberal podcasts on the trial, and conservatives, they tend to do this thing where they begin the story specifically with the riots. How do you explain the Kenosha shooting? Oh, let's just talk about the riots, right? You have a bunch of evildoers. You have a bunch of bad guys that are destroying their own neighborhoods, and we need to protect ourselves against them in some way. It's like the conversation always begins there, right? We never take the causal chain back to where it starts, right? For all practical purposes, we begin specifically with some evildoers doing evil things, and now we need to do something about that, right? And that's very telling. And it's telling because they don't want to start with what's going on in these neighborhoods. They don't want to talk about exploitation. They don't want to talk about anything that is in fact relevant for preventing these riots in the first place, which is why I simply don't take seriously any conservatives that want to talk about rioting in purely moralistic language, right? I was making fun of Glenn Lowry when he was, the rioting, John, the rioting. I can't stand it. The reason why I don't take that kind of shit seriously is if you do in fact believe that riots are so morally relevant that they need to never occur again, you need to present to me some kind of program where these riots would be prevented. And if you don't want to do that, I simply do not accept your virtue signal about the riots. The riots are absolutely predictable. And if they are so predictable, guess what? If you're not doing anything about the fact that we have a predictable outcome and a set of variables that you could tweak to change that predictable outcome into some other kind of outcome, if you're not doing anything about that, then fuck you. I don't care about your moral outrage over rioting. It's pointless. It's simply virtue signaling, right? Liberals get a very bad reputation for their virtue signaling because, they do deserve it. They do virtue signal, and it's annoying. But conservatives do the same shit again and again and again all the time. And this is a prime example. Just listen to some of those podcasts. I mean, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So Kenosha itself, right? This is the other thing. Like sometimes I would look up videos like discussing Kenosha, and I get like all I get is just like discussions of, well, look at the damage that the rioting has caused, right? Let's talk about, let's have some interviews with, people that lost their businesses. And granted, of course, like those are terrible outcomes, right? If you destroy someone's business, I do believe that you ought to be imprisoned, right? Just like if you are a rich person and you do something that is ostensibly legal, right, and perhaps should not be, or is illegal, but you're so protected, I believe you ought to be in prison, right? Of course, only one of those groups tends to be in prison and the other ones is allowed to go free, but that's kind of beside the point for now. So yeah, I mean, I totally get it, right? If you have lost a business, if your home was burned down, these are terrible outcomes, right? And people that do that to you, to your life, they need to be punished. But I never seem to find like that much information about like Kenosha itself. Forget about the rioting for a second. Forget about all of that. Let's talk about the city. Let's talk about the county. Let's talk about like, well, what is going on in Kenosha? Why does a riot occur in Kenosha and not in, the rich black neighborhood I'm only a couple miles away from? And the reason is simple, right? Let's understand Kenosha, right, through this kind of I guess like broader framework of what was going on from the 60s onwards, accelerating the 90s, and found no resolution during the Bush years, during the Obama years, during the Trump years, and will likewise find no resolution during the Biden years. So Kenosha County in Wisconsin, right, per this blue wall, historically Democratic. There's about 100,000 people there. The poverty rate in 2000 was 7.5%, okay? And that coincided with the kind of like peak in Rust Belt incomes. Tons of like, median incomes reached their peaks in the 90s because manufacturing was still there. You had a sort of like, uptick in positive activity, like going back into like, people's pockets due to NAFTA. Of course, like eventually NAFTA would backfire, not perhaps in general, but against, the most vulnerable groups, right? The Democrats started losing votes with, right, as they sort of, either stopped voting altogether or perhaps moved to the Republican Party, moved to Trump. So we had this peak of income in the late 90s. And since that time, things have been going down, right? They especially started going down right after the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. But it's been a downtrend even before that, right? This has to do with manufacturing. This has to do with just kind of how the economy has changed. So we had a poverty rate of 7.5% in 2000. And now in Kenosha, it's 19%, right? It's almost 20%. We're talking about almost a tripling of poverty in the course of 20 years, right? This is, Bush comes into office and he says, I'm going to change your life. I'm going to give you guys tax cuts. I'm going to save families money. Obviously, that doesn't do anything. Obama comes into office and he makes the same promises. That doesn't do anything. Trump comes into office, makes the same promises. Not much has happened since that time, either, right? Um, and interestingly, we have a 19% poverty rate in general, but we have almost a 40% poverty rate for blacks in Kenosha. So I want you to think about this for a second. If you're black in Kenosha, you have a 1 in 2 chance pretty much, right? Or 4 in 10 if you want to be more specific. You have a 4 in 10 chance of being born into poverty. What that means for you is, even if like conservatives want to blame like the parents, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you're a child, meaning you're not responsible for the decisions, if you want to call them that, of your parents, you have a 40% chance of having just like some of the worst life outcomes that occur in this country, right? 1 in 2 chance, right? Every time you walk down the streets of Kenosha, you could be sure that every time that you see a black person and another black person, another, one guy's not in poverty, the next one is, the next one isn't, the next one is. This is the kind of life that is being cultivated in Kenosha. Kenosha is harder hit by manufacturing losses than the rest of Wisconsin, right? It's, we have 11% of black people, 40% of black people are in poverty. Most new jobs, they are white collar, right? They require a college education. The majority of students, last time I checked, in Kenosha are also below poverty line, right? These are jobs that are going to be primarily available to white people, right, and Asian people in Kenosha. So even if some people, right, some incomes are ticking up, if you're able to sort of re-educate yourself, if you're able to move on, good for you. But obviously, this has not happened for a large chunk of people living in Kenosha, especially if we're talking about mediation by race. So in terms of politics, John Antaramian, he served as mayor for 20 years in Kenosha. There was this period where I think for maybe 4 or 8 years or whatever it was, where he wasn't mayor, but primarily he was the mayor. Democrats had been county favorites going back many decades, right? Again, the blue wall. And this has only started to be chipped away out recently, right? Either A, people not voting at all, right, after just being completely disappointed by whatever Obama did and did not do for Kenosha or for Wisconsin. But Kenosha, they went for Donald Trump in 2016. They also went for Donald Trump in 2020, right? They went for him even as Wisconsin, the second time around, was won by Joe Biden. And if you're only listening to this and you don't see the slideshow in front of you, I have some statistics on poverty rate by race, right? So the black national poverty rate is 25%, and the poverty rate for blacks in Kenosha is close to 40%, right? So it's close to double. For Asians, the poverty rate is 6.6%. The national poverty rate is 11.9%, most likely because we are, taking on some of those kinds of, non-bottleneck refugees, right, that exist in like places like in California, right? The vast majority of Asians are able to come to America. They're able to come on visas. They're able to come and be kind of immigrants, which immigrants themselves, right? They are subject to a significant bottleneck when it comes to education, when it comes to like life goals, when it comes to just kind of like day-to-day interpersonal behavior. If you're a refugee, coming from some of the places that America has bombed in the 60s and 70s, you're going to have the same kind of outcomes that black gang members in LA have, which ostensibly actually is what's happening, right? To lots of Asians in some of those communities. But in Kenosha, right, if you're able to re-educate yourself, transition to the white collar, you could do a little better, right? So the white poverty rate is 13.1%. And the national poverty rate is 10.3%. So it's a little bit higher in Kenosha compared to the rest of the country, right? This would explain perhaps some of the white rage that would put Donald Trump into office. Of course, it would also explain some of the reasons why black people, just in general, just said, I'm not interested in voting. I don't believe he's not. I don't believe he's going to do anything for me. Right. I have the second box at the bottom, change in real mean income since 2007 by income group. Right. The top 5%, of course, predictably, right? They had a significant jump in income since that time, right? It's that blue line at the very top. And those at the bottom incomes, right, the lowest quintile, they still have not returned to 2007 levels of income, right? They reached a nadir, right? Like 12, 13% losses during the bottom of that like sort of bear economy, right? 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. And things sort of moved up since then, but they're still below what it was, right? Same thing with every other quintile other than the very top and the next 15%, right? So literally the majority of people living in Kenosha right now, they have not returned to pre 2007 median real income since that time. I'm sorry, it says a real mean income, right? I don't like mean incomes, right? I prefer medians, obviously, because with the way that American economy functions, you could have a huge number of very, very rich people and a far, far, far vaster number of poor people. And any kind of, simple average is not going to take into account realistically what's going on at the sort of like very bottom, right? Whereas a median, you could actually isolate, subgroups, and you could have medians and submedians, right? And this is also very useful when you think about what happened during the 2016 election, right? Where it's true that huge chunks of the population in general have been doing better over many decades. But if you have enough medians, even if they're not the majority, if you have enough medians in the population that are doing poorly, since we vote based, and elect presidents based on the electoral college, those medians are going to eventually allow something, like a Donald Trump to take office. So Kenosha, in a nutshell, extremely poor for a large number of medians, specifically if you're black. 40% black poverty rate. This is exactly the kind of place that I would expect rioting to occur in. So the shooting of Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake, he's shot by cops and he's paralyzed on August 23rd, 2020. Right, this leads to protests and riots immediately after. In fact, that very day that it happened during daytime, right before nighttime even came, there was already groups that were forming, people were marching, people were protesting, and later on in the night, you had some of the protesters remained, and also rioting was introduced to Kenosha as well. Interestingly, when I was listening to one conservative podcast, they spent like literally 30 minutes like talking about the backdrop before even getting to the trial, and they present the shooting of Jacob Blake like, although they wouldn't ever want to say this, they do present it in a way as if it was justified, right? And they point to things like he's wielding a knife. He's some kind of like abuser, right? He's a kidnapper, right? And I mean, it is true, right? He is an abuser, right? He did sexually assault his former partner. He did try to kidnap his children. I believe he didn't have custody of the kids, right? He just sort of like sat in the car and he wanted to take them away. But we ostensibly have laws in this country, and you could wield a knife. You could be an abuser. You could even be a kidnapper, but those things are generally not punishable, generally, by 7 shots in the back, right? I believe it's 7 shots. At any rate, it's multiple shots in the back. And conservatives, right, when they discuss this, they present Jacob Blake as essentially asking for it. And I think in America you could easily get away with that because you've been so kind of gaslit by the American way of doing things that you kind of don't see any other possibilities. But The fact is, and I talked about this with Dan Schneider during one of my artifacts a couple of months ago with him, in most Western nations, right? It's not as if we don't have knife wielding assailants. In fact, we probably have more knife wielding assailants in the UK, in France, and like whatever, because gun laws are much stricter, right? So if you're going to be in China and you want to hurt someone, if you're going to be in the UK, you want to hurt someone, the easiest way is to do it through some kind of a car, a truck, or a knife. But because in the UK, you don't have cops with guns, right? They don't generally need guns because most people don't have guns. They typically don't have these like armored shootouts with gangs, right? Um, so assailants are taken down with pepper spray, the batons with martial arts and restraining. That's specifically in Japan. If you watch some videos on how they handle people with knives or how they handle people that are just being unruly or resisting arrest, they have like a self-folding net. Essentially, you have a couple of cops. They get together, they throw a net on you. You essentially get forced into this burrito. You're restrained. You can't do anything about it, and you're just carried away. There's also a bunch of videos, which I wanted to play some of them, but I think they're gonna flag this video as age restricted, which I don't want to happen. So you could look this up for yourself. In the UK, like when cops come across some guy with like some like a fucking knife or whatever, they use batons. They either crack him in the hands, they crack him in the head. They use martial arts, right? They're actually trained there. Cops in the United States, they get far less training compared with averages, all over the Western world. So you can't actually say, oh, look, he had a knife. He was asking for it. It's true that in Wisconsin, for whatever reason, this was deemed legal. I mean, those cops, they were subject to multiple investigations, including a federal investigation. They were cleared, likely because the crazy part is they probably didn't violate any laws by shooting this guy 7 times in the back for having a knife, right? But again, when conservatives make this argument, don't allow them to just like take control of the turf, right? You simply say the following bit of information. This may be what happens in an utterly insane country like America, which has higher poverty rate, higher violence rate, homicide rate, all those things compared to everywhere else in the Western world. But everywhere else in the world, this would be considered unreal, unthinkable, and yet it happens, right? And also the crazy part, of course, is that I believe there were at least 3 officers that I saw in the video on the scene, right? And to think that to deal with a guy wielding a knife, you need 3 officers and 3 guns, including one officer that will use a gun to shoot him 7 times in the back. Seems crazy to me. Keep reminding conservatives of the following. America is really, really behind, right? If we want to talk about like the Western world, we really are behind much of the Western world in general, right? We were one of the last countries to ban the slave trade. We were one of the last countries to ban slavery. We even had to fight a war over it. We're going to be one of the last countries in the Western world to have universal health coverage. We're going to be one of the last countries in the Western world to change some of these laws, right, surrounding what cops can and cannot do. And these changes will come, right? So anybody now that feels vindicated because, well, this is what the law states, 5 decades from now, even, before that, right? Because police brutality used to be even worse, right? 50 years ago compared to now. So some time from now, like you will look back on this and you will view this as a kind of mania stage before more intelligent legislation was passed. So that's the way that I view the shooting of Jacob Blake. Totally unjustified. If anyone wants to argue with me, don't take it from me. Take it from the self-defense experts everywhere else in the civilized world other than America. So here's the aftermath, right? We have riots that ensue. There's significant damage. Lots of businesses get burned down. Like there's a high school that's damaged, right? There's like damage to a postal office. but again, I would ask why, right? Like, why is this happening? And I've heard very little about this, right? One of the most annoying things over the past year, just following even a little bit some of this coverage, is how much just ground liberals ceded, right, to conservatives, because they don't want to talk about history, they don't want to talk about causal chains, and they don't want to put themselves kind of like, at risk, right? They don't want to be told, well, why didn't you do something about these conditions, huh? If this is what's going on in Kenosha, well, Obama said he was going to make change. What happened? Instead, we see worse, 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 worse. What's going on? Why didn't he do anything, right? And liberals, they typically have no answer, right? When they're told, why aren't many of these liberal-controlled cities, why aren't they better? Why isn't housing better? Why do we have so much homelessness? Why do we have so much violence? They don't have an answer, because to actually have an answer, they would have to have policies. They can't have policies because they can't raise taxes. And they can't raise taxes because they take money from billionaires. And they take money from billionaires because those are typically the things that allow you to win an election. Okay? So this is why liberals don't want to talk about this. Right, rioters, they also targeted a police center. There was a Smith Corrections center. I don't know if it was burned down or just damaged, but it was targeted, right? And the reason why that happens is, and this is also something that neither liberals nor conservatives want to discuss, is, there is an injustice in the state, right? Or let's call it the adults in the room, right? Liberals in power, the adults in the room. There is an injustice in the adults in the room creating all the conditions for street crime to thrive, and then saying, instead of changing those conditions to organically reduce street crime, instead they employ a regressive tax, and that regressive tax comes in the form of incarceration. Now, I think it's perfectly valid to believe, as I believe, that incarceration is a necessary evil, right? I think even in some sort of hypothetical future where incarceration rates are simply going to be reduced. Like I don't expect a century from now for us to have the same level of not only incarceration rates, but also the kind of severe penalties that we get. I don't expect them to stick around into the next century, but even as a necessary evil, they are still a regressive tax, right? Because the state has the power to reduce street crime. And I'm being very careful in my language, right? Whenever I talk about this kind of crime, I talk about street crime versus crime in general, because the crimes that are available to you as a poor person in a black neighborhood look very different, right, than the crimes available to a rich white person or a middle-class white person or a white president, right, who says, I'm going to violate international law, I'm going to invade Iraq, I'm going to kill, hundreds of thousands of people in the process for no discernible reason, and not take any responsibility for it, not be, held liable in any way, right? The higher up that you go in power, the crimes available to you look very different, and the stakes, of course, are much higher, right? The worst case scenario for Black Americans in the United States is you have, under current conditions, a homicide rate of, let's say, maybe like 10,000 Black Americans a year, right, due to the conditions that the state refuses to address, right? That's very different than a war that kills hundreds of thousands of people. It's also very different than, for example, Donald Trump pretending the coronavirus doesn't fucking exist, it's not real, and killing, what's going to be close to 1 million people, if not already 1 million people in the process, right? So it is a regressive tax. It's a regressive tax because the people that shoulder the burden of reducing crime, right, are the people that are kind of, most targeted by crime. They're most targeted in other ways. So it's a regressive tax in that way. And it's a regressive tax even if you concede, as I concede, that this regressive tax, meaning incarceration, is a necessary evil. So last thing I'll say about this is the final bullet point. In places where the state has no legitimacy, the state loses control and cannot protect its citizens against riots, right? One of the reasons why crime is so high in black neighborhoods is black people don't trust the police for good reason to deal fairly with them, to deal fairly with the conflicts they might have with each other. So therefore, they're going to take justice into their own hands. Okay? In lots of places, I'm not sure if people really understand this, but you can't go to cops over things that happen to you. Because if you do that, you will be a target. And you will be a target because it's clear that, well, clearly, this guy is unable to take care of business in his own way, right? He's not willing to sort of do something crazy like arm himself with an illegal weapon and hurt someone for the sake of like preventing hurt, to be exacted upon him or his family. So you'll be targeted, right? So in a lot of places, you can't just go right to the cops. And the reason for this is distrust. Lots of conservatives say, well, that sucks. Why don't you just trust cops more, right? But obviously, that's not how it works, right? You need to actually give black people a reason to trust you, right? So the state loses control. It does not have this kind of legitimacy. It cannot protect its citizens. And on some level, like when rioting begins, you can't simply like stamp out rioting by saying, let's just arm ourselves more, right? Let's just get more armored vehicles. Let's get new and more impressive weaponry. Let's increase the numbers in the police force, right? And the reason why that's not really going to work in the long term, even if in the short term it might, is because you're not addressing those conditions for the riots in the first place. And by not addressing them, you're ensuring that they happen again and again and again, right? We had guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, right? This is a little bit analogous to that. You cannot win a war like that. You cannot win a war like in Afghanistan. You cannot win a war like Iraq. You just can't, because there's all these micro and macro injustices occurring left and right. People see this. They're not going to trust you. The only people that might trust you are like, people like in the cities, right? Why is Kabul so, why was it so fucking surprised that the rest of Afghanistan fell? Well, that's because they weren't subject to America's bombing campaigns, right? In the countryside. They weren't subject to the kinds of conditions that the countryside in general was facing for 20 years. So little by little, you had all these, you had the Taliban elsewhere coming in, encroaching in this territory, and what do you know? They're back in power, right? It was really incredible to watch, right? I remember when I was a child, like hearing about Afghanistan war, seeing the reasons for it. We're gonna like take control from the Taliban, and just like, like watching like Trump, like at the end of 2020, like signing a treaty where control is being handed over back to the Taliban. It's really incredible, but it's also predictable, right? This is what happens, right? And because this is what happens, militias, when it comes to riots, they are a predictable response, right? And here's the thing, like I don't want to be one of these people that says stuff like, well, I think militias should be made illegal. I don't really believe, because I don't really believe that, right? There's going to be scenarios. I can imagine scenarios even in a modern country like America where a militia might be necessary, right? And I'm not comfortable with simply like ceding all that ground, all that territory, under the assumption that, oh yeah, the cops are going to protect me always. The army can protect me always, because it's simply not true. And also, I mean, like, if we reach the kind of stage where we're talking about like whether or not armies can or cannot protect you or whatever, we already have like enough of a breakdown of the law where whatever the law states doesn't really matter, right? A lot of people don't seem to get that the law does, it doesn't come from the ether. It's not coming out of nowhere. In a state of nature, there is no law, right? There's a survival, right? There's power, right? There's Nietzschean power. There's a will to power, and the strongest will to power is the thing that supersedes all, right? So and militias exist kind of like a little bit in that gray area, right? Because on some level, like it's true, the cops were not protecting people's businesses, they were not protecting potentially people's lives, and the reason why they weren't doing it is they couldn't, right? It would be fucking humiliating to try to like arrest all these people and get like Molotov cocktails like thrown at you, like being in the news for like, accidentally or even intentionally, killing some guy that happened to be unarmed, right? Then, you go like cops don't want to deal with that kind of shit because they know that they can't, right? They can't. So armed militias form as a result of this, right? But here's the thing: even if you agree with me that militias should be allowed, right? It's still, just like incarceration, it is still a de facto regressive tax because it creates fear, uncertainty, and death. And it also, ironically, it erodes state power even further. Every time that a militia pops up, that is a de facto admission that the state cannot do what it needs to do. There is a social contract. We pay taxes to be protected. And if you cannot protect people, militias are going to form out of this gray zone. But again, it is a regressive tax, right? And it's just more of the state ceding power to private entities, which I am absolutely against, right? I do not want the state ceding power, but it's been doing this for many, many decades at this point, right? Look at the tax regime, right? In 2020, if you donated money to money to all kinds of places where you could deduct off your taxes, they let you literally deduct 100% of your income. And that is such a total abdication of responsibility. You are saying that I, as a state, do not have sufficient programs and do not have sufficient funding for these programs to take care of the homeless, to take care of people that are experiencing hunger or other kinds of issues that are exacerbated by coronavirus. So we're going to allow you temporarily, but still we're going to allow you to take off 100% of your taxes, right? Due to your donations. That is a total abdication of state power, of what the state ought to be doing. And I am against that. And to the extent that the militias have to exist, it is simply because I understand that states will always have these moments, whether they endure or not, is one thing, but they're always going to have these moments where they don't, take on the responsibilities that they need to. They don't act in the way that's responsible. And therefore, you're going to get militias that come about. But again, even if you are conservative and you agree with me on this, you're going to have to also admit that it's a de facto regressive tax. You simply have to look at the events during the Kenosha unrest for you to see that this is in fact true. So now I'm going to give you guys a neutral timeline of events. I'm going to try to not say too much of my interpretations here. I will then give you a trajectory of events that I think was also likely with a lot more kind of of my own interpretation. But I'm just going to give you guys here stuff that is uncontroversial in terms of this is what happened. Of course, I can bring in a ton of other stuff into this discussion, but I won't, right? I'm only going to give you what we have on videos, what we have based on witnesses that appeared, right, during the trial. And we're going to stick to that for just for the meantime, but we're going to move on to other more interesting questions in a little bit. So neutral timeline of events. We have a car dealership is burned down, right? We have significant damage to small businesses. Many of them don't have insurance. So, many liberals are like, oh, fuck you. What are you worried about? You just got insurance covered. Not only is that kind of like just asinine in terms of what people actually go through when they experience property loss like this, it's also just literally not true, right? In a lot of these cases. A post office was damaged. There was a high school. There was a museum that was damaged. So Kevin Matthewson, he gave this, he was called up at the trial, and he also gave an interview to the New York Times. I suggest you check out that video. This was a video from, I believe, just a few weeks ago. It's on YouTube. New York Times did this, where they're just kind of going over the Kenosha shootings with the witnesses that were there. So Kevin Matthewson of the Kenosha Guard, he creates a Facebook event page to recruit armed citizens, right? And this attracts thousands of eyes, like thousands of people either like this or respond to it in some way. Kyle Rittenhouse does not see this post. He comes independently, But the reason why I want to bring up this Facebook post is, and this is another crazy thing that I just have not seen liberals discussing this aspect of it until I was kind of looking into this myself. So this is what the text read. Any patriots willing to take up arms and defend our city tonight from the evil thugs. So just to be clear, this is a semi-professional. I think he did some kind of like detective or police work previously in his life. This is an adult man. He's older than me. This is someone that has worked in like the local city government. So this is an adult saying this. An adult man thinks it's a good idea to start a militia essentially through Facebook, which is weird enough as it is, right? Through Facebook. And the text of it reads, any patriots willing to take up arms and defend our city tonight from the evil thugs. Now, this isn't even like a judgment against like, you know, the rioters, whether or not they're evil thugs. Well, I mean, whatever. Take whatever position that you want on that. What I'm saying here is this seems very, very unprofessional. If you're gonna be a militia, I think you ought to be subject to some kind of rules. And one of the rules ought to be you should not be allowed to recruit armed men through social media, which tends to attract the wrong kind of people to begin with. And you should not be able to do it by using inflammatory language like evil thugs, right? And the reason why you shouldn't be allowed to do it is because of the kind of comments that you got, right? You got comments such as, quote, I fully plan to kill looters and rioters tonight. And there are other posts with similar responses. You see the kind of comments about, you know, the Rittenhouse trial on YouTube and elsewhere where people say the same kind of shit. This is this is just a recipe for disaster. You don't want the kinds of people that are motivated through this kind of thinking, right, to show up with weapons, right? You simply don't want this to happen. So going forward, Alex Sherman believes that militias ought to have the right to exist simply because we see time and again the state reneging on its responsibilities, but it ought to be, as the Second Amendment states, a well-regulated militia. And this is not a well-regulated militia. This is just a bunch of fucking sloppy Joes, not G.I. Joes, sloppy Joes, doing things, saying things they're not supposed to do because of the kind of inputs and the kind of cues that they're receiving, right? From the adults in the room, right? Now, Kevin Matthewson, he's not a liberal, but he's also the adult in the room. He's the one making this post. And he has some responsibility here to act like a fucking grown-up, right? And he's not acting like a grown-up in this message. This attracts the wrong people. So in the daytime, Kenosha has peaceful protesters, right? This is on the day of the Jacob Lake shooting, and this is for several days after. And, you know, the protests peacefully continue even after the Kenosha shootings with Kyle Rittenhouse. So downtown Kenosha has peaceful protesters in the daytime, but many are in conflict with the armed men, right? They claim that they feel intimidated by the presence of assault rifles. Most protesters are unarmed, and this conflict is a recurring theme. We get Rittenhouse in his recent interview saying that he saw a bunch of people that were armed. It's clear that some protesters were armed, but it's obvious if you look at the footage, right? If you look at all of that, if you look at witnesses, there's a huge discrepancy between the level of arms that the various militias have that arrive versus the protesters, and even later on, the rioters, right? And we know that to be the case because, again, were the protesters, in fact, all armed, Rittenhouse would literally not be alive right now, and that's a fact. Funny part, right? Again, adult in the room, Kevin Matthewson, he leaves after the 8 p.m. curfew. There was a legal curfew there. Cops were not arresting militia members or even peaceful protesters that were breaking curfew. They were kind of like trying to get them to leave and stuff, but they were not arresting them. But I guess Kevin Matthewson, after making this comment, right, this post, do you want to defend our city from the evil thugs? actually, when the true rioting begins, which is always in the nighttime, he decides to get out as soon as the curfew hits. He's in bed by 9 p.m. So you could tell he's either a true adult in the room, right, going to bed really really early, or he's a 7-year-old child who goes to sleep at 9 p.m. So this Kenosha Guard, right? Whoever the Kenosha Guard was, whoever these men were that arrived due to social media, or maybe his friends or whatever, they are essentially at this point without a formal structure, without a formal head, and this to me is a problem, right? In a world where we could have two alternatives, either cops or militias. I will always prefer cops, even though I have tons of stuff that I say here that's negative about cops, right? Anybody that follows my work should not be surprised by this. But I prefer, cops to private entities in almost all cases. And here you have a militia that the one person there that claims to be the leader, claims to be some sort of like semi-professional, he's out, right? And many other militias are in the same category, right? They don't have leadership, they don't have structure. This strikes me as a problem. Now we have an escalation of tensions. So after curfew, peaceful protests turn violent. There are 30 businesses on fire at this point. So this is on the night of the Rittenhouse shooting. There are 30 businesses on fire. There's an attempt to breach the Kenosha courthouse. There are these like barricades that are built to prevent this from happening. The police at this point, after the curfew, they are far away on one end of the street, right? When you see the final video of Rittenhouse running to the cops, right? He's running towards the direction of the cops. There's a growing number of unrelated militias on the other end of this. I forget which street it was. On the other side, right? There's one militia leader, Ryan Balch. We have a picture of him here on the right side for those of you that are not watching but only listening. He arrives with his armed men and he tells protesters that the police have intentionally pushed protesters towards militias, thus escalating tensions. Kyle Rittenhouse is asked to protect a car dealership by its owners, possibly in exchange for money. It seems like there was some kind of a promise of payment, which again, I want everybody watching this, whether you're a conservative American or if you're like, outside of the country, just think about how insane America is, that we could have a situation where a 17-year-old is promised money to get an AR-15, bring it to a protest, and to protect the business, right? We have, and this is legal, by the way, we have legalized child soldiers in America, right? Forget about how crazy it is for anybody outside of America to see a protest being attended by men holding AR-15s and other weapons and body armor and other shit like that, right? We have legalized child soldiers here. And I'm gonna keep coming back to Ryan Balch and his statements throughout the night, his behavior throughout the night, because I think he's a very interesting figure, right? He's used to be, I guess, part of the Boogaloo Boys, they're a right-wing group they're anti-state, right? They're kind of like anti-state capitalists. And Ryan Balch says a ton of interesting stuff at the trial, right? At this New York Times interview, right? Part of this kind of like wider footage. And one of the things he says that stuck out to me is this. Speaking of Rittenhouse and the men or boys that he shows up with, they weren't on the level of me and my guys. But the more guys you've got, the better off you are, right? So this is like a militia mindset. Cops are not there. They're being irresponsible. They have like all left the protesters and the rioters as well. Here, they sandwich them in between the militias. And a militia would think, you know what? Cops aren't here to really do much. And we have to take matters into our own hands. So the more guys we got, the better off you are. But he is conceding pretty much to Rittenhouse and perhaps other people, right? Not just, his militia. There are other militias here. There are a bunch of sloppy Joes here, right? And there are a bunch of sloppy Joes that are part of this sandwich, right, in which the protesters are the meat. And this seems like this is an important part of the puzzle. I wonder why all the times that liberals have just all the fucking time waste that they do, all the wasted time that they spent on turning Rittenhouse into like a fascist or a Nazi or whatever. Why weren't they talking about stuff like this? Like, what were the militias doing? Who were they? Were they professionals? Were they perhaps misbehaving? Right? Because this will be the crux, right, of some of the arguments that I'm making here in terms of culpability, right? Even if you don't have legal culpability, legal liability, you seem like you have a ton of moral culpability here. And we're going to talk about that. And these kinds of statements are going to be critical in assessing that culpability. So the escalation, unsurprisingly, leads to a confrontation. On the right, I have an image of Joseph Rosenbaum. I believe this is from, there's also a video from Washington Post from a year ago. I believe this is the video from Washington Post. So you see Joseph Rosenbaum. He's here. He's confronting one of the militia guys. I'm not sure exactly who that guy is. And other protesters, they're confronting a militia here. If you watch this footage, like everybody's arguing with each other, right? Escalate, like everything is escalating again and again and again. The same like recurring patterns are they're recurring, right? Conflicts about guns, conflicts about you guys are outnumber us in terms of weaponry. So this is kind of like the background here, right? So anyway, shortly before 11:45 p.m., Kyle Rittenhouse is chased by Joseph Rosenbaum, and Rittenhouse attempts to flee. Right, this is a critical part of the self-defense claim. In Wisconsin, you have it's called a duty to flee, and it's clear that in pretty much all the footage that we see, Rittenhouse does attempt to flee. Right, he's not trying to necessarily shoot anyone. He's trying to get out of the situation, which is exactly what the law demands of him. Rosenbaum throws a plastic bag of hospital items in his direction, and Joshua Ziminski fires a shot into the air. Ziminski is another protester, although he comes very close to also being a rioter, right? Because he does set things on fire. He does have an illegal weapon. He does illegally shoot this illegal weapon into the air for whatever reason, right? Escalating tensions. This is not the kind of behavior that you want to see from anybody. Rosenbaum lunges at Rittenhouse, tries to take his rifle, and Rittenhouse fires several times, killing him. Now, maybe this part isn't totally neutral, right? There is some argument as to whether or not Rosenbaum tries to take his rifle. But even if we scratch that, I mean, the trajectory of events here is Rittenhouse is fleeing, right? He's being pursued by Rosenbaum. Someone, he doesn't know who, shoots in the air, right? As far as Rittenhouse is concerned, he might feel like, all right, maybe someone is shooting at me. Maybe it's this pursuer who, according to witnesses, right, it's only fair, right? If I'm going to use Ryan Balch's statements, I also need to use a statement that he made at some point where, with an earshot of Rittenhouse, Rosenbaum approaches the group. He threatens to kill all of them if he finds them alone at some point. So Rittenhouse might very well feel like, somebody might be shooting at me. So after lunging at Rittenhouse fires several times. He kills him. A crowd naturally begins to pursue Rittenhouse with some yelling, "He shot someone." Many assume he is an active shooter. He's hit in the head and falls. A man catches up to Rittenhouse and kicks him in the head. This is called a drop kick man. So Anthony Huber hits him with a skateboard and attempts to take his gun. Rittenhouse shoots and kills Huber. He tries to shoot the guy that kicks him in the head. He misses him. Gaige, Grosskreutz, who was a protester there, who had a legal weapon and was in fact a licensed EMT, he points a handgun at Rittenhouse, right, thinking, okay, active shooter. and therefore he is shot in the arm. After he's shot in the arm, Grosskreutz just runs off, and Rittenhouse continues to run in the direction of the police. They probably don't know what's going on, right? They didn't see what happened, right? They just tell him get out of the road, leave. He tries to surrender. He cannot surrender. He ends up having to surrender the next day at Antioch. And the reason why he surrenders at Antioch and not Kenosha is because Kenosha does not allow anyone to. The police department basically was not accepting visitors, and essentially he would be a visitor at that point. So I want to talk a little bit about legal and moral culpability. On the right side, if you're not watching this but listening, we have the Kenosha Guard post, which says, again, any patriots willing to take up arms and defend out city, right, is literally what the typo was. Tonight from the evil thugs. Non-doubt, they are another typo. They are currently planning on the next part of the city to burn tonight. Again, very, very inflammatory, over the top, gets people in the wrong fucking state of mind. If you want to be an armed, responsible adult, responsibly protecting businesses or whatever you think that you're going to be doing there, not exactly the proper context for that kind of thing. I think, if anything, ought to be subject to some sort of civil liabilities. Who knows if that's in fact going to happen? But, it strikes me as there needs to be some kind of law where Matthewson is held accountable for this kind of crazy shit. On the bottom image, it's part of a video where you see Rittenhouse in the center removing graffiti earlier that day from a school, right? So he's doing something good, right? I don't think he arrives at this place to quote hunt protesters, right? A lot of liberal outlet newspapers wasted a lot of perhaps good capital and attention doing shit like that, right? When again there's tons of other stuff that you could discuss. So again, let's talk about legal versus moral culpability. So soon after the shooting, the liberal narrative takes shape. Rittenhouse arrived for the purposes of murder. Rittenhouse is a white nationalist, a neo-Nazi. Rittenhouse shot 3 black men. This is another funny thing, right? Lots of people that were following the case, in fact, did not really follow it to the extent that they believed that black men were the ones that were shot, right? They were all white men that were shot. Rittenhouse had an illegal weapon and committed a federal offense. The weapon was not illegal. He actually had the legal right to have it. He also did not travel with it. It was actually in Kenosha. Because legally it was supposed to be in the possession of his friend. I forget the name of his friend. And when legally he was able to get this weapon from his friend, he did so, right? So he did not cross state lines with a weapon. He was not driven to the protest by his mother, but I still see this everywhere, right? This did not happen. A trial, the prosecutor, Thomas Binger, does not present any fresh evidence. Part of the reason why I didn't really follow the drip of evidence is, I wanted to see exactly what would be allowed in the courtroom. And there was very little that was allowed except for a grainy video that he claims shows Rittenhouse pointing his rifle into the crowd, or at Zeminski, rather, I think is what he explicitly claimed. And honestly, look, when I first saw that video, I was surprised to see it. But I spent a long time, right, like 20, 30 minutes, just like rewinding again and again, trying to see what Binger was pointing to. And the thing that annoyed me especially is that he had this like really kind of, sassy, overconfident attitude where he was like, where you could clearly see Rittenhouse put down the fire extinguisher and point his rifle into the crowd. And it annoyed me because like I kept rewinding it and I kept cursing. I was like, what the fuck? Like, where is it? Like, I felt like I was wasting time, right? Because I didn't see anything. So this wasn't very good evidence, right? Obviously, it didn't sway the jury in any way. Clearly, I do think that if there was video footage of Rittenhouse pointing his gun into the crowd, well, sorry, at that point, everybody in that crowd has a legitimate self-defense claim against Rittenhouse. They have every right then to neutralize Rittenhouse as someone who threatened essentially to kill them, right? But we don't actually have that video, right? And it's interesting because when you look at some of the outlets like AP or Reuters or whatever that were talking about this video, right, they characterize it as a video that the prosecutor claimed showed Rittenhouse, pointing a gun or whatever, because you can't really see that in that video. And so, beyond the trial, is Rittenhouse in any way morally culpable, even if not deserving of a life sentence? Right? You could separate those two questions: the legal liability versus the moral one. You could also say, perhaps, that even if the legal liability, as it was presented, meaning like life, like a life sentence, is not appropriate, another kind of set of legal penalties would be appropriate, which is my belief, right? And I'll talk about why later. So is anyone else culpable? What do we make of the adults? And this is going to be a common refrain here, right? What do we make of the adults in the scene? What do we make of the militias? What do we make of the people that hired a 17-year-old to be child soldier, right? To protect, their business, right? As if this fucking kid has any kind of business doing that. What do we make of the liberal adults, either, crafting these asinine narratives about the shooting, or essentially putting into motion all the events that would eventually lead to the death of multiple people, right? And I'm saying that the answer in terms of moral culpability and perhaps even some legal liability, it might be in how you reconstruct that night. And for whatever reason, I've seen no obviously logical and rational reconstructions of that night, right? And so this is why I'm going to, this is probably why I'm doing this video, and this is what I'm going to do here now. So after I gave you a neutral timeline of events that, mostly, everybody more or less agrees upon, I'm going to give you another trajectory of events, right? What I believe happened. And this is based not just on the evidence of the trial. I'm basing this on all the footage that we have, all the witnesses that have come forward. Although some of the witnesses, there's a witness that's named Jeremiah. I don't know if that's his actual name, right? He claims that he saw Rittenhouse at some point when he was trying to go home, and Rittenhouse started yelling at him and pointed his rifle at him. I'm not even going to talk about, Jeremiah here. There were other comments that he and also another witness made that were interesting, because we don't really have video footage of this. We don't have other people publicly discussing that. So I think it would be a little bit unfair to just spring this into my argument, especially since, I don't really think my argument, even needs that, right? I'm perfectly comfortable and perfectly secure arguing from the turf that I'm going to argue from. Right. So this is another trajectory of events. And frankly, I believe it's the probable trajectory of events. And I believe this is likely why Rittenhouse might be legally culpable in some ways, although not at all deserving of a life sentence. But more than the legal argument, which is hard to make, so I'm not really focusing on that. I believe he would be morally culpable. And even more than Rittenhouse, the adults involved, I believe, are very much morally culpable here, if not legally culpable. So another trajectory of events. On the right-hand side, we have a picture. This was from the New York Times interview. And originally, I guess this footage is from some live streamer, whoever, called the Rundown Live. And it's a picture of an armored cop car. And it says, and the cop is saying, from the speakerphone, "We appreciate you guys, we really do," speaking to the militia, right? So just the idea that there's this kind of alliance, right, between the militia and the cops, and everybody else is sandwiched in between. So another trajectory of events: there was rioting on the night of Jacob Blake's shooting. The Kenosha Guard and similar posts attract a mix of trained former professionals and sloppy Joes, right? And sloppy Joes, to me, are what Ryan Balch, right, characterized them as: inexperienced, untrained militias that mix with protesters and rioters, as indicated by militiaman Ryan Balch. So there is recurring tension between protesters and militias, even in daytime, over weapons, right? According to one video, this only intensifies throughout the night. And it is interesting. Like you see footage like during the daytime where you have protesters that, they're not doing anything bad, right? They're just like walking around, they're saying stuff, and militias are already there, and they're arguing with them, about weapons, right? So after 8 p.m., cops treat protesters and militias very differently. Okay, so we have this in the New York Times, when they did this interview, they interviewed I don't know if it's like the chief or whoever of like the Kenosha Police Department, and he was like, well, we weren't arresting members of the militia or protesters that were breaking curfew. This is true, but they were dispersing protesters. They were telling them to go home. There was one woman, a black lady, who basically said that a cop like intimidated her to go home, and said that she was going to get hurt by the cop if she didn't go home. And this is enough of a threat to many people to go home. So they hassle and threaten protesters to leave. Many do, while militias are thanked, rewarded, and left guarding infrastructure on the other end of the street. Okay, again, try to imagine this. We have a sandwich. The meat of the sandwich is protesters. We have on the west side cops that are saying, we don't want to do our fucking jobs because we can't actually do our jobs, and we're going to get ourselves into a bad situations, because cops understand, right? There's a reason for these fucking riots. They understand, and they don't want to deal with that reason, right? And they don't want to feel like the pigs, right? So therefore they don't deal with it. On the other side, we have the paramilitary. And the reason why I'm calling it paramilitary at this point is it's not just at this point a private militia, right? They are the deputies of the state, right? This is why it's called a paramilitary. It's not an official military group, but the state, meaning the cops, are treating it as an official military group. And I don't care what you think about militias, whether they should exist or should not exist. The fact is, there should not be alliances like this between militias and between cops. It's going to lead to the wrong kind of outcomes, right? According to Washington Post, like this emboldens the militia. You could disagree to what degree this happened, but I mean, just use your common sense. I mean, like if you've ever been in a protest, or you've ever been in this kind of situation, especially if you're a 17-year-old, like imagine you're a 17-year-old and someone tells you like, okay, you have a legal right to be here. You have a legal right to hold an AR-15. You have a legal right to do whatever you want to do here. And we are going to actually thank you and protect you and reward you and leave you alone. As a 17-year-old, you're going to be like, oh my God, I wanted to go on a fucking adventure, and I really am on an adventure, and I'm being thanked for it. And they're giving me all this power. I mean, just imagine that you're a kid, right? I'm not even saying to take it to some sort of like evil scenario. Like, you don't have to take it to some sort of like asinine, amplification. You could simply think of being a 17-year-old and adults giving you these kinds of cues, right? They should not be giving 17-year-olds this kind of cues, and they should not be giving other adults these kinds of cues. They're cops, right? They're being paid for by taxes. They have a fucking job to do. To the extent that they don't want to do their fucking job, they're going to be subject to penalties. And in fact, there's multiple lawsuits right now surrounding their behavior that night. Okay? The reason why I'm spending so much time on this is I want you to understand the context of what's going on. We have people from all over the fucking place. We have mostly protesters, right? That's like the bulk of the crowd are protesters that aren't hurting anyone. And then you have militias that are there for all kinds of reasons. Maybe some are there to be on an adventure. Maybe some saw the Kenosha Guard post and said, yeah, I want to defend my city from the evil thugs. Maybe there's people with other kinds of intentions. But they're being deputized by the state. All right? So imagine that being the kind of context that we're talking about. This doesn't strike me as something that is going to lead to any kind of good outcome. Okay? So even if we forget about the personal liability of Kyle Rittenhouse, because again, I'm seeing a far wider kind of macro scope that should never have been permitted to occur, right? The city is very much liable for what happened in Kenosha that night, 100%. Even if you want to skip personal liability for a second, the city is liable. They are sending these cues to the militia. They are sending these cues to a 17-year-old. That's a problem. So, going on, some witnesses, including Corey Washington, he actually gave testimony at the trial, and he also appears during the New York Times interview from last month. So some witnesses, including Corey Washington, state Rittenhouse seems young, unaware of what's going on, nervous, unsure of himself. Ryan Balch at some point says that he looked exactly like the kind of person that rioters might wish to pick on, which I do believe eventually is what happened because he was like, not confident because he was so young. I mean, just look at this picture here, right? There's a picture of him on the right side of this PowerPoint, and it's that famous footage of him just with his nitrile gloves, and he's saying, "If there's somebody hurt, I'm running into harm's way. That's why I have this rifle." So people around him notice this, that he's young. Like multiple witnesses, in fact, say this. They're like, what is he doing there? This is kind of weird. What's going on? And on some level, right, he sort of understands this about himself, right? He understands that he's unsure of himself. So he falsely identifies himself as an EMT, and he falsely identifies himself as 19 years old to the militias, right? He spends a good chunk of the night with Ryan Balch's militia, but other times in the night he is alone. Other times he's, with other militias, right? So he knows he's not supposed to be there, right? He knows that he would, quote, get in trouble, right? And be rejected by the protesters and the militia, right? This is why he fakes his identity, right? He also fakes his identity because he's not confident, right? He like everybody says, he seems unsure of himself. And I mean, why wouldn't you be unsure of yourself? You're in a fucking like adult playground. You're doing adult things as a 17-year-old. So you know that you're not confident here, right? You wouldn't be confident here. This is a dangerous situation. And some guy, according to your own testimony, comes up to you and says he's going to fucking kill you. Of course, you're not going to feel confident. So to compensate for this lack of confidence, you're going to identify yourself as 19 years old. You're going to say you're an EMT. You're going to make yourself seem more valuable to this scene than you are. So Rittenhouse knows that he's not supposed to be there. He knows that he will be rejected. He knows that he's useless in this situation. He's scared to be here. He knows he's not supposed to be here. So my question is, even before we get to the legal side of it, is there any moral culpability here? If you know that you're doing something that you're not supposed to be doing, do you have any moral culpability? Even if there's no legal culpability, right? What about the adults? Again, these kinds of laws aren't on the books, but if we're going to keep militias legal, I would definitely recommend having some kind of law in place where if you're going to recruit people in your own little fucking militia, or you're going to link up with them throughout the night, you better show some fucking like ID or something to prove that you're not going to be a child soldier, right? What about the car dealership, his mother, right? Like again, before we even get to Rittenhouse himself, there's all this stuff going on with the adults that just completely nobody wants to talk about it because liberals need to turn Rittenhouse into an ideological foe and into this sort of like idealist creation, right? Where if only he wasn't a Nazi, if only he was some other way, this wouldn't have happened, right? They need to do that. They need to pretend this isn't a structural problem. So to quote Ryan Balch and also to use the testimony from Rittenhouse, at some point Joseph Rosenbaum threatens to kill Ryan Balch and Kyle Rittenhouse. Perhaps this happened once in the night. Perhaps it happened twice in the night. But I do believe that it happened. I don't necessarily have a reason to think that they're lying about this based on just like other context, based on other things that Balch has said, based on what other witnesses have said. It seems believable, right? So Rosenbaum threatens him and walks away. He continues having to be calmed down by protesters throughout the night. This is also true. There's lots of footage of people trying to keep him from escalating with the militias. Right. This is a flashpoint again and again between militias and protesters. The weapons and they are trying to restrain him. The prosecution claims Rittenhouse points his rifle at Joshua Ziminski as he vandalizes cars, thus enraging Rosenbaum and starting the altercation, but there is no evidence for this. On the right side, we actually have a photo of Joshua Ziminski. This is a still from footage during the night. He is the bearded man smiling. On the right side, there is a zooming in on the pistol that he's holding. And he's just kind of, walking around holding this pistol. Maybe some people feel threatened by this. Maybe some people don't. I'm guessing the militias generally don't because it is perfectly legal to open carry in Wisconsin. Most people probably assume that, okay, he's just, walking around holding this pistol. He probably has a legal right to it. He doesn't have a legal right to it. This is an illegal weapon. And he actually has his own trial, I believe, next month or maybe later, whatever. But again, like we don't know whether Rittenhouse points his rifle at Ziminski. But after the prosecution brought up this thing, right? It interested me because I didn't really hear this too much before, right? Like, oh, he has evidence of this, right? He has evidence of him pointing his gun. So I started doing some research into what the militia was doing throughout the night, right? And I asked this question, right? And this description, right, that the prosecution gives a Rittenhouse, is it in keeping with the environment that night and what others say about Kyle Rittenhouse's behavior? Because I think this is also an important question to adjudicate. I wish we had more footage. I wish we had more witnesses to ask about this. And for all I know, there probably is more stuff out there. It's just hard to find. But it's a question that ought to be adjudicated. This is very, very important, right? To establish either legal or at the very least moral culpability that night. And as I'm researching this question, I came across some very interesting stuff, right? On the right side, we have two pictures, two stills from footage from the New York Times. The top one is Ryan Balch speaking to protesters, and he says, "The cops were straight up with us, that they were going to push you all to us." And the rest of the quote says something like, they're going to push you all to us, make you guys enraged, then wrap you the fuck up, meaning like arrest you, beat you up, whatever. Right. So Ryan Balch is saying that to protesters, and actually, it seems like it's true, right? Like that's the other thing that strikes me as kind of interesting about Balch, right? He is ideologically not in the same wavelength as these protesters, and yet he's saying something about these cops because he himself actually is not he doesn't trust cops, right? He's a right winger, but he's a right winger in the sense that the Boogaloo Boys are right wingers, right? They are anti-state, anti-cop, right? In the same way that BLM is loosely speaking kind of like anti-cop in that way, right? Again, perhaps for different reasons, perhaps in different ways, but he is an interesting figure throughout all this. The second image that I have on the screen is there's a bunch of militiamen. They're on top of a building, right? Kind of like almost kind of like a war zone, right? And someone says this. Now, this could be directed to a cop. This could be directed to a militia leader. I'm actually not sure. And the quote is, "Hey, if you can keep people from pointing their guns at the crowd." This seems like, look, if you're trying to get a cop or a militia leader to get militiamen, right? Many of whom, according to Balch, right, who is a militia leader himself, are sloppy Joes. If these sloppy Joes are routinely threatening the crowd by pointing their weapons at them, the crowd has a legitimate claim of self-defense against the militia members. Now, I don't know exactly what they would be allowed to do in that situation, but it doesn't seem like the militia is very innocent here. The question, of course, is to what degree is Rittenhouse copying this behavior, right? So another witness slash live streamer, right? He relates seeing Ryan Balch's men agitating the crowd, not Balch himself, but some of his men. In fact, there's some piece of footage where some militiaman like gets in the face of a protester and says like, "Want to fuck around and find out?" Maybe he himself was being agitated by protesters. Who knows? But Ryan Balch, like, kind of like being, I think, more mature than most people in this situation. He tells this guy like, hey, like, calm down, like, back off, right? Meaning, we're the people that are armed, right? These protesters are protesters, right? Maybe some of them will become rioters, maybe some of them are rioters, but we're the ones that are heavily armed. We need to behave in a way that's in keeping with human beings that have such responsibility on their shoulders, right? Having like fucking AR-15s everywhere, right? You need to be the mature ones. You cannot allow yourself to be agitated by protesters. Because if you're prone to meltdowns, guess what? You shouldn't be in the militia and you shouldn't be in that crowd. You should have nothing to do with that night. So again, protesters, they're repeatedly in conflict with militia over weapons, right? In some cases, they are accusing and asking them not to point their guns, right? This is several times. It's not just this photographic still that I have, right? In other situations, it seems like the militia was in fact pointing guns at the crowd. Which leads me to Rosenbaum himself, right? And it's kind of funny, right? Because when I was listening to those conservative podcasts, right, they always kind of like zero in on Rosenbaum, yelling, "Shoot me, shoot me." And of course, he says something a little bit after that, right? He uses a racial slur. I'm not going to use a racial slur on this video. But anyway, when Rosenbaum is like running around and saying, "Shoot me," everybody's treating this as a joke or merely as evidence of Rosenbaum's just kind of, volatility. And the funny thing is, like, it is kind of true, right? It is an example of his volatility. Most people wouldn't be coming up to armed militia guys and saying, "Shoot me, shoot me." But at the same time, he's not just randomly like letting out a stream of fucking words, right? What he's saying in that footage is, "Shoot me," and not this other guy that you've either pointed your rifle at or threatened in some way or did something that you're not supposed to do, given the fact that there's such a huge differential between your heavy arms and our almost total lack of armaments, right? This is really what he's saying, right? He's emphatically saying me compared to shoot. It's clear in the context of what's going on in that specific video. This is what's going on. He is, by the way, not the only one arguing with the militias in that video. In that specific piece of footage, it's true that he's being restrained by protesters who themselves are also arguing with militia guys, but they're arguing, but they're also at the same time trying to de-escalate in the same way that the armed militiaman that Rosenbaum is arguing with, he himself is being restrained by another militia member who is being pulled back out of the frame, right? So this militia guy that's arguing and is being told by Rosenbaum, "Shoot me," right? A de-escalation occurs. Protesters pull back Rosenbaum. The militias pull back their armed man, right? Because they don't want to see an escalation. They understand that they are the ones that are armed, right? This shouldn't be occurring. But Rosenbaum, again, he's not randomly saying shit. It's fine. It's fine to say that he's volatile. It's fine to say that him going around to armed people saying "shoot me" is an example of this volatility. But it's completely unacceptable to just dismiss these statements as if they're coming out of nowhere. Now, this is where it gets really interesting to me. One piece of footage, I have it. I have the link written down. I'm also going to put in the show notes, but I have the link written down here if you want to see the specific time. Right, it's T equals 913. Right, this is it's seconds. Right, if you want to get this specific point where this occurs, but one piece of footage. This is actually from Washington Post, right? This is like a year ago. So one piece of footage has a man. He's sometimes called Yellow Pants Protester because he's wearing yellow pants. You could see him on the right here in this image. He makes a sarcastic remark to Rittenhouse. So Rittenhouse in this image, he's facing the yellow protester, right? And the reason is the protester engages him at some point, and this is why. So Rittenhouse is walking around and he's shouting, "Medical, medical, medical," and this yellow pants protester, he says, "You were just the one talking about get off the car. I remember you. You said get off the car." And he makes his hands in this kind of motion, right? Kind of like holding the gun. "Now you're trying to do medical? I remember you. You said, get off the car." And then a man says, "What, yesterday or today?" And then the protester says, "Today. He just had up the gun talking about get off the car. Now he's talking about medical." So a couple of distinctions, right? On the one hand, the way that he's holding the rifle here, right? It's not as if that he's pointing it, right? He's not pointing it at anyone, right? But he is sort of, holding it in some way that I guess to the protester is made to look threatening. But when he elaborates on what he means, again, this is what he says. Today, right? This happened today, earlier today. He just had up the gun talking about get off the car. Now, do we believe that this is just some random fucking guy that is lying? It doesn't seem to me like he's lying. In the same way that I accept that it's likely that Rosenbaum came up to some of these militia guys and threatened to kill them once or twice. This seems probable too, and this seems probable because here's this guy confronting this Rittenhouse, and we have all this other evidence of the militias behaving exactly in this way. We have an example of protesters either asking a cop or a militia leader to stop the militias from pointing guns into the crowd, right? Because that's only going to lead to a bad fucking situation. Even if you believe that there's someone in the crowd doing something they're not supposed to do, such as like standing on top of a car. You're not supposed, why would you point a gun at them? Because by Wisconsin law, you wouldn't be allowed to shoot them. So why would you threaten to shoot them by pointing a gun at them, even if you think they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing? He believes that what Rittenhouse did was threatening. Again, whether or not you believe that he pointed the gun, according to this protester, Rittenhouse did something threatening. At some point, militias were pointing guns into crowds. At some point, it's very possible, very, very possible, that Rosenbaum simply snapped because of all this. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think it's reasonable precisely because of everything the conservatives have been saying about Rosenbaum, that he's volatile, that he can't be trusted, that he threatened to kill someone. And this final bullet point, was Rittenhouse singled out for the militia's general behavior? It seems likely to me that Rittenhouse, being, like Ryan Balch says, being young and inexperienced and someone that could easily be liable to be taken advantage of by protesters and later on, perhaps rioters. I think it's possible that Rosenbaum, isolated someone that was easy to isolate, right? Meaning Rittenhouse. And I think Rittenhouse became the scapegoat for the general behavior of the militias. And because of the fact that he's 17 and inexperienced, a little kid, he got himself in a fucked up situation, right? Knowing that he's not supposed to be there. Knowing that if he were in fact 17 years old and everybody knew that he wouldn't be allowed to be there. The militias would tell him, get the fuck out of here. I think all that is true, right? So this creates a very different dynamic for this kind of thing, right? It's not so much that you could even necessarily pin any kind of legal liability in Rittenhouse, right? And you could even say that, well, maybe it's technically unfair that he was the one being singled out for the malicious behavior. But again, I don't think it's unreasonable to deduce from all this that Rittenhouse at some point did point his rifle at people. Maybe it was one person, maybe it was two, maybe it was three, maybe it was more. But he's a kid. He's among adults. He's going to take his cues from other adults. That's what kids do. That's reality. And it seems like the militias were misbehaving. Put all those factors together, a scared 17-year-old who shouldn't be there, who in an ideal society would be criminally liable, at least for a few years, right? But again, that's not up to me. Those are the laws in Wisconsin, right? Like I said from the very beginning, as soon as I saw the footage, I was like, he's not gonna. There's too much video evidence for him to be, guilty of like a murder to the point where he's going to be locked away for life. That's not going to happen, right? And liberals, because they want to be so like over the top here, and they want to like throw anything that they want against Rittenhouse. They overcharge. They do too much too fast. They do a terrible job of accumulating evidence. I mean, I'm watching like the trial. Like, why isn't the militia like a central part to all this? I mean, I get why, right? I mean, it's about Rittenhouse and his behaviors, right? But I feel like there's been so many wasted opportunities. If in fact you believe that there needs to be like justice served, right, in the kind of legal fashion, more than anything, more than like legal fashion justice served to Rittenhouse, I believe there needs to be a complete reworking of these laws. So the final part here, right? How Kyle Rittenhouse was used, right? Because he was used, right? Liberals used Kyle Rittenhouse to create a Nazi scapegoat and escape blame themselves. We don't have to fucking worry about Kenosha, right? We don't have to fucking worry about a 40% poverty rate. As long as we get all the Nazi ideology out, that's fine, right? So you need a Nazi scapegoat so you could have all those other parts of the narrative, right, that are very self-serving, self-accommodating. Conservatives, on the other hand, right, they use them for their pet causes. This was obvious from the very beginning. They were going to use him for his pet causes. It was obvious that the original legal team that he had, they used him for his pet causes. They fucking sent him into, to pose with these Proud Boys, right? I doubt Rittenhouse even understands that he's doing this kind of like, I'm not even sure if I want to call it a white supremacist hand gesture, because I mean, it didn't start as one, right? It started as like some 4chan bullshit. It was picked up in the media as like a serious thing. So then people that were either white nationalists or white nationalist adjacent, right, they started doing this kind of shit, and it became kind of like a more like generic right wing thing, right? Remember, like in 2017, there were all these like freakouts about members of Congress or like people in the Trump administration, like posing with this like white power symbol. But anyway, it's very possible that he didn't even know what this was, and he's being sent by the defense team here, like, oh, meet up with these Proud Boys. They're going to be like your security detail. And on some level, like, they must understand that this is going to be very bad for Rittenhouse in terms of like, prosecute, because there is going to be a prosecution of him, right? And regardless, like they put him into this like harmful situation where it's going to harm his legal case in some ways, perhaps. On another level, though, and this applies to everybody, right? Not just like the original defense team. They did stunt his growth, right? To the extent that here's a kid that did something so obnoxiously stupid is now being called a hero, you're gonna have some stunted ass growth. And like, look at his shirt, right? It says free as fuck on it. Now, if I were Rittenhouse and I got myself in that situation and I felt bad about it, as a 17-year-old, I probably would have thought like, oh shit, like, okay, so Rosenbaum chased me. I thought that he was going to take my weapon. I did the right thing by shooting because I needed to defend myself. But fuck, like, what about these other guys that started chasing me after the fact, right? What about these other people? They only chased me because they thought I was an active shooter. The whole crowd that wasn't, harming anyone, they kept yelling, he just shot someone, he's a shooter, he's a shooter. And now I have these people chasing me because they think I did something bad. And I'm so scared that I'm not going to disarm myself. I'm going to keep running with a fucking rifle as everyone points at me. He just shot someone, he just shot someone. And now, even if I have a legal self-defense claim against them and I end up killing them, doesn't that feel so terrible? That I'm killing people that are under the wrong impression completely. And I got myself in this situation. That's what I would have thought if I was a 17-year-old in that situation. And I would never be walking around with a shirt like free as fuck. Because even though I might feel like I have every right to not be in jail, I have every right to defend myself, I definitely would not be smiling and laughing and sort of like almost making light of the situation, because those other people that I shot thought they were doing the right thing. And if I were in their situation, I would have done exactly what they did to me. Right? That would be the mature kind of response. But this is a 17-year-old kid without a fully grown moral compass. And he's going to be 20, and he's going to be 25, and he's not going to be allowed to have a proper moral compass. And the reason why he's not going to be allowed to have a proper moral compass, even beyond the ways that he's being like used originally by the defense, is because he needs to be a hero to the right, just like he needs to be a Nazi to liberals. And that's because liberals have a set of motivations and a set of desires and a set of policies and a life vision that accommodates them and only them, just like conservatives have the same, which accommodates them and only them. They clip the causal chain. Conservatives clip the causal chain. Liberals clip the causal chain. And we have situations like this, right? A kid who might otherwise have become normal, he's never going to be allowed really to truly self-reflect on, not even like, take Rosenbaum out of the picture, the other two men that he shot. He's not going to be allowed to do that, right? He's not going to be allowed to come to terms with this part of his reality. Okay, final slide. And so I'm basically just asking this, right? Like, will Kyle Rittenhouse be allowed to grow up, right? And I mean, I watched the Tucker Carlson interview that he gave. There was some other interview that he gave for about 45 minutes with some woman. I forget her name. And like, even here, right? I mean, so Rittenhouse, he's talking to Tucker. He does correctly point out that, yes, I was originally used by my defense team for their own kind of like political goals, for their own ideological ends. I'm glad that he's able to recognize that much, right? And that he complains about the fact that they put him in this situation where he ends up like taking this photo with Proud Boys and ends up like doing damage to himself and his reputation. I mean, like, if anything, like, so many of the Nazi headlines came specifically because of this. I'm not sure to what degree like the original defense did this to sort of like take people off the trail of like really what ought to be adjudicated, which is like, what was Rittenhouse's behavior among the militias? What was the militia's behavior? Is anyone else liable for any other reason? But they put him in the situation, and Rittenhouse recognized that. But Carlson, like, during the interview, he keeps like doing these leading questions, right? And he keeps getting Rittenhouse, who's all too willing himself to do this, he keeps getting Rittenhouse to deviate from court record, right? So you notice how, like, for the purposes of this video, I'm not talking about, so much about the words of Jeremiah, who said, like, Rittenhouse, point his gun at me and was shouting at me. There was this other witness that basically said something like, after he shot Rosenbaum, all the militia members were like, "What the fuck? What are you doing? What are you doing?" Like they're like, "Oh, based on body language, based on, what they were saying, it's clear that they knew that Rittenhouse fucked up seriously." I'm not like spending too much time on those people because uh, that is also like really far from either footage, right, which we could all see, which we could all sort of like adjudicate ourselves, and that's also too far from court record. But Rittenhouse constantly, he's deviating from the court record, right? There's things that he could legally say in court, right, in terms of like testimony, in terms of like making the arguments. But now that he's a free person, he could sort of do whatever he wants with his reputation. He could put a sort of kind of a new spin on what happened that night, and he does this again and again throughout, right? So it's clear that beyond what he's allowed to do in court, he's trying to rehabilitate his image. He's talking about all these like massive lawsuits that he has planned for people that have called him a Nazi, a white nationalist, all this other stuff. So and Carlson, right? He's encouraging all this, right? So again, we have Rittenhouse, who's now 18, still a kid in my eyes because I remember being 18, I was still a child. And Carlson, who's like a fucking like he's like in his fucking 50s, and he's still acting like a 17-year-old. In some ways, acting even less mature than, in fact, acting less mature than Rittenhouse, because at least Rittenhouse has an excuse, right? He's 18, right? Tucker, right? He's an adult, right? With his own kind of motivations. And one thing that especially annoyed me in his interview with Carlson is how Tucker was subtly shifting from using the word protesters to using the word rioters. And Rittenhouse, whether knowingly or not, I mean, maybe he didn't know this, maybe this was unconscious, but he made the same kind of shift. And I noticed the same kind of shift happening when I talk to people from my life, just people that I know personally about this case, right? I know people that are far more conservative than I am, that are far less willing to accept the trajectory of events as I have presented it in this video. And in our, back and forth, there's this constant conflation of protesters and rioters, when in fact, literally all the footage that you see, that you can find, most people, even after curfew, whether it's militia guys or whether it's protesters, they're not doing crazy shit. They're mostly walking around. They're leaving each other alone. They're not trying to necessarily, get in, with anybody. Like, most people are fine. That's really what most of the crowd is like. But Tucker Carlson and also other people that I know, they want to make this conflation that, oh, for example, if the militias had pointed their weapons at the crowd, I mean, who gives a fuck? They're rioters. And there's no evidence of this, obviously. There's no evidence that most of the people in that crowd were rioters. And when they started talking about Rosenbaum, Tucker said something like, and when you saw Rosenbaum being restrained by the protesters, by the rioters, what did you think, right? And Rittenhouse responded in the same way, right? No, like, yeah, the rioters sometimes were restraining him, like literally like using this completely inflammatory, charged word that is also absolutely inaccurate based on all the evidence that we have, and would be considered completely unacceptable in court. Yes, when it comes to the actual rioters, the judge said you could call them rioters. But generally speaking, a crowd of protesters would not be allowed to be called rioters because they're not rioters. But Rittenhouse does not seem to notice this. And Tucker, of course, he knows what he's doing, right? Sort of eggs him on, right? So this is an example of Rittenhouse by Carlson, who's an adult in this situation, not allowing Rittenhouse to grow up, to mature into an adult, to cultivate an actual moral compass that will be useful for him in other situations down the road. They are stunting his growth, right? At some point, Tucker shouts, It's hard to believe that this is happening in an American city. And Rittenhouse kind of agrees, right? Talking about the rioting. And again, this is also, Rittenhouse is young, right? So it's not like I would really expect him to like really understand the nuances here. But to Tucker, I would ask, like, I mean, is it hard to believe that this is happening in American City? What, you mean riots? It's hard to believe that riots are happening in American City, really? After every fucking racial riot that we've had going back, over a century now, going back to the 1800s, you could find examples of racial riots starting specifically because of the behavior of cops. And you're saying after virtually no changes to these communities and also to how policing is done, you're saying that you're surprised that this is happening in cities? What part of it is surprising? There's no part that is surprising. And by the way, if in fact it was shocking and surprising, there would be a far lesser moral argument here. The mere fact that it's not surprising, it is like clockwork. We know exactly why riots occur. We know exactly why militias form. Because those things are not surprising and so predictable. This is why they are so morally totalizing. Riots are morally totalizing because we know exactly why they happen, and yet we do nothing to prevent them from happening. We know why militias form, and we do nothing to prevent them from happening. So it's not surprising. And the fact that it's not surprising is what gives this entire question any kind of moral force, right? So, third bullet point. If Kyle Rittenhouse is a hero, so are Grosskreutz, the jump kick man, and Anthony Huber, who hit him with a skateboard and was then fatally shot, right? At no point other than Ryan Balch, right? Ryan Balch said, you come through looking wild with a gun on you, people are going to think that you're doing something wild with a gun on you. So they reacted the way that they should have reacted. Anthony Huber went down like a hero. Again, this is Ryan Balch. This is the militia leader saying this. Ryan Balch is the guy that Kyle Rittenhouse spent like at least maybe 50% of his time with during that night. And Ryan Balch is saying this. So if you want to call Rittenhouse a hero, you're going to have to say that Grosskreutz is a hero. But we don't get that, do we? Right? And Rittenhouse, at no point does he say, it's really fucked up what happened because I would have done the same thing. And I killed people, therefore, that although I had a right to neutralize them, they were innocent people. And this is what's killing me. This is what's making me vomit. This is what's going to eat at me for the rest of my life. Instead, he simply says, you know what? I simply had a right to self-defense, and now I'm going to sue everybody that said otherwise. That doesn't strike me as anyone that grew up. He's still 17 years old. That's the crazy part. He's going to be 17 years old substantively for so much of his own existence. And that's really sad. It should be especially sad to conservatives who, want to pretend like this guy is a hero. They want to pretend that they care about him. And to get what they want, however, out of all this, to get all the ideological ends that they want out of all this, they need to stunt his growth, right? They need to keep him in this kind of perpetual state. They need to also turn him now into, he's not going to be a militia member anymore, but he's going to be a combatant, right, for their cause, right? He's now going to sue everybody that damaged his reputation. Anyway, I guess I'm going to leave it here. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't hit like, please do so. This helps my videos a lot. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. That also helps me a lot. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.